In this lecture, we will see the clustering fundamentals. Now, what is clustering? So, it is the task of dividing the population or the data points into the number of groups. And such data points in the same group are more similar to other data points in the same group than those in the other groups. So see here what we are doing. Depending on the similarities between the data points, we are grouping them into the clusters. So similar data point come into one cluster, another similarity come into the next cluster. So likewise cluster or group we are constructing that, and that group we call it as a cluster. So if we consider two different cluster, so it may happen that the data points present in one cluster is more similar to the data points of the same cluster rather than the another cluster. Okay, so in simple words, the aim is to segregate groups with similar states and assign them into the clusters. So we can understand this with an example. Suppose you are the head of the rental store and wish to understand the performances of your customer to scale up your business. Now, is it possible for you to look at details of each customers and devise a unique business strategy for each one of them? No, definitely not, right? So, but what can you do is to cluster all of your customers into say 10 groups based on their purchasing habits. So what we can do in this case, we can group our all customers into the 10 groups depending on the purchasing habits and use a separate strategy for customers in each of these 10 groups, and this is what we call the clustering. Okay, so depending on the purchasing habits, we are dividing our customers into 10 groups and we are applying different strategies for all the 10 groups. So that is nothing but the clustering. So broadly speaking, clustering can be divided into two subgroups, that is hard clustering and soft clustering. So hard clustering, each data point either belongs to the cluster completely or not. For example, in the above example, each customer is put into one group out of the 10 groups. This is the hard clustering. Now what happen in soft clustering then? It is depend on the probability of likelihood of data point to be in the those cluster is assigned. So if we divide it into 10 groups, so the depending on the probability it will assign that particular customer into that particular group. For example, in the above scenario, each customer is assigned a probability to be in either of 10 clusters of the retail store. So this is the only difference between hard and soft clustering. Now we see the types of clustering algorithms. Since the task of clustering is subjective, the means that can be used for achieving this goal are plenty. So various methodologies are used to set the rule for defining the similarity among the data points. So in fact, there are more than 100 clustering algorithms known, but here we will discuss certain. So connectivity models. So this is one of the type. So connectivity model, as the name suggests, these models are based on the notion that the data points closer in data space exhibit more similarity to each other than the data points lying farther away. Obviously, if we plot data points into the xy planes and if we consider one data point is near to the in xy plane 0 0 and one data point is at 5 5, right? So data points which is closer to the 0 0 must have the must possess a similarity between them than the data point which is farther away from this, right? So these models can follow two approaches. In the first approach, they start with classifying all data points into separate clusters and then aggregating them as the distance decreases, right? And in second approach, all data points are classified as a single cluster and then partitioned as the distance increases. So likewise, we can do the partitioning over here depending on the similarity and depending on the distance. Also, the choice of distance function is subjective. So these models are very easy to interrupt but lacks scalability for handling big data sets. So it's very difficult to handle big data set by using this model. Next is the Centroid model. So these are iterative clustering algorithms in which the notion of similarity is divided by the closeness of data points to the centroid of the cluster. Now centroid is nothing but we are considering the center of the cluster. So depending on that data points, it will form that center point for that particular cluster. And likewise that data points also, that centroid point get also shifted as per as we apply the algorithm and as per as the data points get separated. So k-means clustering algorithm is the popular algorithm that falls into this strategy. So in this model, the number of clusters required at the end have to be mentioned beforehand. How many clusters we want at the end, that we have to define at the start. So these models run iteratively to find the local optima. Next is the distribution model. So this clustering model are based on the notion of how probable is it that all data points in the cluster belong to the same distribution. Means all data points should belong to same distribution. That is the notion for distribution model. So these models often suffers from overfitting. A popular example of this model is expectation maximization algorithm, which uses multivariate normal distribution. So where this distribution model is useful when all the data points can form a same distribution. Next is the density model. This model searches the data space for areas of varied density of data points in the data space. It isolates various different density regions and assigns the data points within these regions in the same cluster. So popular example of density models are Debiscan and Optics. So these are all different types of the clustering. Now here certain clustering basics are given. That is here X is considered as the data set with the different points, and here certain criteria is mentioned to specify a group, and that finding that group is nothing but the clustering. So this is how we can mention the different clusters over here on the XY plane. So these are the data points. So 4 different clusters here form. So this is all about the clustering fundamentals. So in next lecture we will see the k-means clustering algorithm.